March 13th, 1982. A cold spring day in the small Belgian town of Dinant. Two shadowy figures slipped into a local arms shop and in broad daylight walked out with a stolen 10-gauge shotgun. No shots were fired. No one was killed. It seemed like a petty theft, until history proved otherwise. The witnesses recalled two men, one of average stature, the other a tall man who media will later dub the Giant. Within months, this petty theft would mark the beginning to one of the most violent crime sprees in Belgian and European history, with 28 dead and many more injured from the later dubbed Brabant Killers. The gang would escalate from petty theft to brutal and merciless robberies, killings and thefts. They struck grocery stores, gun dealers and businesses. In some attacks, food, coffee or wine was taken. But in others, innocent men, women and even children were shot and killed for reasons that remain unclear. They left behind a trail of fear, questions and horror that still haunts Belgium today. Even now, decades later, police are still wondering about the identities of the three behind the gang, which still remains a secret so well kept that we may never know. This was not just a crime wave. It was a nightmare. And it all began with a single stolen shotgun on March 13th, 1982. By the spring of 1982, Belgian police were puzzled, but not alarmed. A shotgun stolen from a store in Dinant on March 13th felt like a local burglary. Petty, small, almost mundane. Only a few witnesses spoke of a pair of men slipping into the night, masks low, silhouettes vanishing into the dark. But while investigators filed the Dinant incident away, far from the police station and beneath the surface calm of Belgium's streets, a trio was already coalescing into something far more dangerous than simple thieves. The press would later give them names that seemed to leap from the pages of a thriller. The Giant, an unnervingly tall figure whose presence commanded the room. The Killer, the cold-eyed shooter who would become synonymous with every fatal act in the gang's reign. And the Old Man, the silent shadow who navigated escape routes and made sure the others could strike and vanish without a trace. To ordinary citizens, they were just rumors, whispers on street corners and anxious conversations over breakfast. But to the few seasoned detectives who had studied the Dinant file closely, there was something about the way the shotgun was taken, the quiet precision, the lack of hesitation that hinted at more than random criminals. It was practiced, cold, like the preliminary move of a game where no one yet knew the rules. Days turned into weeks. August came, and Belgium's sleepy towns were about to wake up to a terror unlike anything they had ever experienced. Belgium's nightmare. Belgium's nightmare was still young. Months earlier, two men had stolen a shotgun in Dinant, an odd headline in the local paper, soon forgotten by most. But on the night of August 14th, 1982, something darker stirred. Across the border in Maubeuge, France, a quiet town less than 10 kilometers from Belgium, the air was thick with a summer stillness. Inside the Pio grocery store on Place des Nations, boxes of wine and shelves of food waited for the morning crowd. No one suspected the violence that was coming. At just before 4 a.m., a pane of glass shattered. Two figures slipped through the break, their faces hidden, nerves on edge. One of them ripped out the phone lines as the other moved with practiced calm toward crates of goods. They were stealing food and wine. simple loot for most criminals. But these men were not ordinary thieves. Meanwhile, 3 French gendarmes, seasoned officers used to petty thefts and late-night disturbances, were jolted awake by a call from an anonymous witness. Someone had broken into the grocery store. Sirens began to wail through the sleeping streets as they sped toward Place des Nations, lights cutting through the darkness. For the gang, loading stolen goods into a vehicle was routine, methodical almost. But as the gendarmes closed in, their approach was misread as mere curiosity. The first officer rounding the corner saw movement, heard the crackle of the radio, and was met with gunfire. Bullets tore through the night. One gendarme, just 36 years old, was struck in the abdomen, falling behind a decorative fountain as chaos exploded around him. Another officer, caught in the open, felt bullets whiz past. He dove behind a stone wall, heart pounding, rifle clutched tight. His radio crackled with frantic static. Shots fired, were taking fire. The gang did not hesitate. Every instinct screamed escape, yet they fired again, not to intimidate, but to wound. The night erupted into a firefight so sudden, so violent, that even hardened officers were shocked by the ferocity. One of the gendarmes was seriously wounded in the head. The other managed only to fire one shot, and then misfire under pressure as the scene blurred into chaos. In those moments, the police who had trained for domestic disturbances confronted something far more dangerous. Criminals who didn't flee at the sight of uniforms, who matched force with force, and seemed unafraid of death. For the gang, it wasn't about the grocery goods. No, it was a statement of power, a disregard for life that was chilling in its audacity. Within minutes it was over. The wounded lay in the street. The stolen wine and food were abandoned in the fleeing vehicle as the gang vanished into the night, leaving behind bullet-scarred pavement and officers trembling with shock and unanswered questions. That night in Maubeuge was not just a robbery gone wrong. It was the first time Belgian and French gendarmes realized they were dealing with something unprecedented, a group whose violence was disproportionate to their gain and whose willingness to shoot at police heralded the arrival of a terror that would soon grip 2 nations. By the early hours of August 15th, 1982, Maubeuge was quiet again. Broken glass glittered on the cobblestones, bullet holes scarred the grocery store's facade, and the faint smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. But Belgium and northern France were anything but calm. What had unfolded the night before, 2 gendarmes shot as the gang stole wine and food, reverberated far beyond the small-town streets. Inside the French gendarmerie, officers sat in stunned silence. For men used to petty thefts and occasional barroom fights, the sheer audacity and violence of the attack was shocking. Reports were filed, evidence carefully collected, and calls placed to Belgian units across the border. Everyone knew this was not an ordinary robbery. Someone had crossed a line. Belgian investigators, reviewing the details from Dinant, began to connect the dots. The pattern was emerging: careful planning, methodical execution, and a terrifying disregard for human life. Detectives would later recall feeling a growing unease that the criminals were always one step ahead. As one officer put it in an interview years later, "It was as if they knew what we were thinking before we did. We were chasing shadows." The media, sensing a story too compelling to ignore, seized on the event. Headlines warned of the Brabant Killers, a name that would haunt the country for years. Reporters replayed the night's terror in print and on television, fueling a mix of fear and fascination. Citizens across Belgium and northern France reacted in equal parts dread and disbelief. Parents checked locks twice, shopkeepers reinforced doors, and every shadow in the street seemed to carry menace. One resident later recounted, "We didn't know if it was safe to go to sleep. Every knock on the door made your heart stop." For the police, frustration and fear were intertwined. Witnesses gave fragmented descriptions: shadows, masks, flashes of weaponry, and no clear identities emerged. Internal reports repeatedly noted the same chilling reality. The gang was highly mobile, unpredictable, and most unnerving of all, seemingly unconcerned with the consequences of violence. Federal prosecutors would later reflect that even after dozens of stakeouts and interrogations, the killers operated in a way that left us constantly off balance, always uncertain what they might do next. What happens next will shock everyone.